Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. This is UrzaMaster here, coming from you to me. Wait a minute. With me, as always, Fert Derby and Lord Uther. Welcome, gentlemen, back to Academy of Starfleet. And we are talking on our 65th episode of the Warp Core Podcast, the original series of Star Trek, Season 3, Episode 1, Spock's Brain. And I am excited to kick off Season 3, 65 episodes deep into the Warp Core. Before we get into the episode, I want to do a quick poll of the cast here. Out of 7 Warp Cores, how do we rate ourselves through 65 episodes? Lord Uther, take us away.
I'm rating me.
Rating the show, our show.
Our show? I mean, we push the warp core engines to 115%, so I'd have to go whatever 115% of 7 is. 8.5 warp cores. I'm just making up numbers because I did not do very well in math, which is why I teach social studies. So for me, we are 8.5 out of 7 warp cores. What say you there, Fert?
I always try to leave room for improvement. I think we're a solid gentleman C right now. So I'm going to say that to date we're probably about a 5. But I think this third season, particularly if we can survive some of the bumpier warp core potholes that are coming for us in this third season, I think we'll easily cross that threshold into immortality. So as far as this crew, I think we're 10 out of 10, but I think sometimes we don't have a lot to work with, and I think Season 3 it'll be like going to warp speed and there's an asteroid there, and then we decide to go with phasers, and then Decker will countermand us and belay that order, arm photon torpedoes, and then we'll have to pull Decker aside afterwards and have him explain himself, and it's just going to get very complicated. But yes, we are the definitive Star Trek place for knowledge. That's common knowledge. So that's where we are.
I like it. I like both points of view. I definitely feel like we have gone beyond the Warp Core here on the Warp Core, and I'm going to give us a rating of 7 of 9.
Nice.
Jerry Ryan would be proud to be on the Warp Core podcast, and that is our first celebrity guest. Welcome, Jerry Ryan. Wishful thinking.
We're just extending our invitation to her
to Jerry
anytime.
Ryan. We would love
Yes.
to pick her brain. Tremendously talented actress, of course. Famous, I believe, only for her portrayal of 709. Just kidding. Annika Hansen. From the Picard series and Voyager, and hopefully Paramount Star Trek Legacy coming up. I definitely do think we have broached the territory of 7 warp cores at times. I do think there are some episodes where we could improve, and I agree with Fert Derby. It depends on the source material. So that being said, Season 3 is the final season of the original series of Star Trek. Couple of reasons for that we'll get into throughout this run of episodes, of course. But as you all out there in this alpha quadrant of ours may know, Season 3 is fraught with some of the more unique episodes that a lot of people point to as the quote-unquote downfall of the series. We've already seen Cat's Paw and the Alternative Factor, so I can't wait to talk about those episodes in particular. But we start today with Spock's Brain. And this one is a bit controversial among Star Trek fans. So let's turn it over to Fert Derby for some background and dive right on into Season 3.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks, Trekkies, for coming with us this far. We still have miles to go before we sleep. Star Trek, the original series, Spock's Brain, Season 3, Episode 1, first aired on September 20th, 1968, when the country was tearing itself apart. But thankfully, they could all return to their favorite crew of NCC 1701. This episode was directed by returning champion Mark Daniels, and this will be his final turn behind the camera. And I want to take a moment and celebrate Mr. Daniels because he was the co-leader in the clubhouse with 14 episodes of the original series under his belt, and we've seen them all, and we've actually talked about them all on the Warp Core. And here's a brief recap of Mr. Daniels' Star Trek career. He actually directed the very first episode of season 1, No, Not the Cage, the unaired pilot that eventually was chopped up and sold for parts to the Menagerie. Mr. Daniels started off on a high note with The Man Trap, which we discussed in Warp Core 28. Go back in the archives. We really did it. It's there. We have receipts. So he started with The Man Trap. He gave us The Naked Time from Warp Core 31. He gave us that first part of the aforementioned Menagerie in Warp Core 33. He gave us Court Martial in Warp Core 38. And he gave us our encounter with Khan in Space Seed in Warp Core 39. Those were all his Season 1 contributions. Season 2, Who Mourns for Adonis? One of Lord Uther's favorites. Warp Core 44. I think it has the green hand. Up there it is. There it is. That's a Mark Daniels episode. He also did The Changeling in Warp Core 45 and Mirror Mirror in Warp Core 45. We said nice things about both of those episodes. The Doomsday Machine in Warp Core 46. I Mud in Warp Core 47. A Private Little War in Warp Core 58. By Any Other Name in Warp Core 61. And he got to direct Terry Garr and a Black Kitty in Assignment Earth, Warp Core 65. So he did the last episode of Season 2 and the first episode of Season 3. And then Mark Daniels bade farewell to Quadrants Alpha, Gamma, Beta, and any other in the known Federation. But he wasn't the only one that was concerned about where their next paychecks might be coming from. After Season 2, NBC was prepared to cancel the show, and in fact had made plans to do so. The ratings just weren't what they were hoping for. And you have to remember that back then there were only 3 viable television networks: ABC, NBC, and CBS. And the slice of the pie of the audience was much more concentrated and much bigger than you would see for similar shows today. If shows today were getting Star Trek's ratings from seasons 1 and 2, they'd be amongst the most celebrated and talked about shows in all of television. By contrast, one of Lord Uther and mine's all-time greats, Twin Peaks, when it was on ABC in 1990 and 1991, ABC initially canceled the show, and it was getting close to 29 million viewers a week. By contrast, the most popular and well-rated show in television, let's say over the last 5 years, has been Paramount's very own Yellowstone. And Yellowstone, at the height of its ratings, like where people are tuning in and making it the #1 show on cable television, were oftentimes between 5 and 6 million viewers. So with all these new channels and all these streaming options and all this different selections, if you will, the audience has been pared down and fractured, and now shows can survive with less than 1 million viewers if it's very visible and driving conversations and social media likes and the like. So when we say Star Trek was in danger of being canceled for low ratings, we have to keep it all in 1968 perspective versus now. Like I said, it would be a killer with those numbers in 2024. But anyways, NBC was prepared to show Desilu and the Enterprise crew the door, but a couple, Betty Jo Trimble and her husband John, Betty Jo affectionately shortened to Bjo, amongst many fans over the years. They led an aggressive letter writing campaign. I mean, this is the days before emails and TikToks and any kind of social media, but they had people writing letters, putting stamps on the letters and mailing them in, and they inundated NBC executives who were just suddenly bombarded coast to coast with "please don't cancel our favorite show, leave Star Trek on, please." And to be fair, those campaigns have worked infrequently over the years. They generally tend, executives, once they start talking about dollars and cents and all of that, they rarely have their hearts thawed. But in this case, it did work. NBC said, sure, we'll give it another go around. More people better watch, but we'll give it a third season. And they even promised the fans that they would get a very favorable slot on Monday nights at 7:30 p.m., which at the time was prime real estate in television appointment viewing. But instead, those NBC executives turned out to be Romulans and Klingons in disguise, because when season 3 finally unspooled on September 20th, 1968, it had been given the so-called death slot, the kiss of death for television, Friday nights at 10 p.m. Eastern. So the kids, even though it was heading into a weekend, 10 p.m. Eastern, particularly in target-rich environments on the East Coast, like Boston and New York and so forth, big ratings magnets, kids weren't even allowed to stay up to watch Star Trek, if you will. And everybody else said, hey, it's Friday night. I'm going to go down to the local tavern and see all my work buddies that I've spent all week with. And we're going to have nuts and commiserate about the good old days. So they weren't staying at home, unfortunately. And as a result, NBC, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Low ratings continued to beget low ratings. And we'll follow that march all along season 3 there. At the same time, by bringing it back, they slashed the show's budgets considerably. And there are examples that we can point to, and in fact we'll point to later in this season, of ways that they had to cut corners, cut costs, and keep it down to something that made them feel a little bit more confident. I want to finish the background of season 3 with a quote from Leonard Nimoy about Spock's brain. And this was how he perceived the episode as being a key participant. Frankly, during the shooting of that episode, I was embarrassed, a feeling that overcame me many times during the final season of Star Trek. Now, those were particularly harsh words coming from Leonard Nimoy, who, let's be fair, was kind of struggling with the idea of an actor, a photographer, a director, a creative soul who did not want his entire life defined by pointy ears and a cold, unfeeling, logical worldview, and was very concerned about making sure that Spock was not the only defining thing that people remembered him or his art for. So you have to understand, again, quotes in context. But I would disagree with the late Mr. Nimoy. I don't think he had any necessary reason to be embarrassed. I would take issue with 50 years plus of fandom who have dubbed Spock's Brain the worst episode in all of the original series. Believe me, when I speak for my fellow bridge crew members here at the Warp Core, we've seen worse Star Trek episodes. We've endured worse Star Trek episodes. I'm looking at you, Who Mourns for Adonis. I'm looking at you, Cat's Paw. I'm looking at you, The Apple, just to name but 3. The Alternative Factor, one of Lord Uther's all-time favorites. This is not in that league of where creatively and production-wise that they just sort of skid it out. Yes, I think the shipmates sitting beside me will agree. It's a little goofy. It's a little out there, But at the same breath, if you're starting a season and you want to kind of start it with a bang, why not give it a little bit of a punch? Why not try to blur the lines between what was possible and what was impossible? Not only was this Mark Daniels, one of his, it was his last episode. This is one of the last episodes, not the last, but one of the last for Gene L. Kuhn, who was the writer. But he didn't even take the credit. He went under a pseudonym of Lee Cronin. And again, maybe it's just that I have the perspective now of seeing the other shows and all the Trek history that has come after it. Like I said, folks, maybe this isn't the pinnacle 7 out of 7 warp cores, but this is far from a disaster if you go along with sort of an out there premise that aliens beam aboard the Enterprise and overpower the crew using devices of pleasure and pain and steal Spock's brain to run their society, and the Enterprise crew has to like literally recover Spock's brain and reunite it with his body. I mean, if this isn't the Katra from Star Trek III Search for Spock, I mean, we went right through this and nobody might seem to mind then in Reagan's America in 1984. So why it was such a big deal in 1968, it was a different time. I took down notes, gentlemen, and some of them are cryptic and some of them are spot on. Nurse Chapel's back, and I'm never going to complain when we see her assisting Dr. McCoy. So thank you, Major Barrett. We have blue title cards after 2 seasons worth of yellow Star Trek and the Enterprise zooming past us during Captain Kirk's voiceover. Now we've gone blue. It's the blue period for Star Trek Season 3. It appears Scotty needs a haircut in these early episodes. I love Montgomery Scott, but it looks like he's got a thicker, fuller hair. Might be using Nutrifoil. But I think he could probably use a trim there. That's just me. It was the 60s after all. And it's not like he was one of those long-haired hippie types that everyone was complaining about apparently during that time. I thought this episode had really good crew interaction back and forth. I believe there was a sequence early on the bridge where Chekhov and Uhura and Sulu and Scotty and Kirk are all kind of tossing around McCoy. There just seemed to be a good dynamic. This clearly was a set of actors and a set of crew members who were by now knew everybody's strengths and how to play to those. And I thought this episode was a good example of that. And yes, Leonard Nimoy does sleepwalk through this episode, but that's on purpose. That's part of the plot. And I think the idea of him sort of guiding McCoy through the reunification of his brain, physical, corporeal brain with his body, I found that both amusing and entertaining in a lot of different ways. So, gentlemen, again, opinions vary, but I am not convinced that this is singularly the worst episode of Star Trek by any measure. And like I say, maybe there's some things about it that are just a little bit silly, but I think the silliness actually works to keep me going through the episode. Like, I bought in. I had buy-in, and I feel like while it's not exemplary Trek, it is far from the dregs of the Academy. So what say any of you on Spock's crew?
I think the biggest thing is that I think the last 50 plus, almost 60 years have been very kind to this episode. It definitely is a little odd, but knowing what we know today about neuroscience and actual real brain surgery, which has come an extraordinarily, like back then they were still giving people lobotomies. So, you know, what we've learned about working on the brain is actually influenced by this episode. And that's kind of powerful. I think of the episode of House. They have a couple episodes where they do brain surgery of some kind. And there's one in particular where the person is awake and talking to them while they're doing actual brain stimulation and surgery. I think even House in the episode where we find out that Wilson's girlfriend is going to die, basically. Very heavy episode, but they have to poke into House's brain, and it's sort of the same kind of premise. Nobody steals his brain, but he's awake, they have his skull open, he's talking them through how to basically pull his memory out of his head, which it sounds like science fiction, but it's realistically it's science fact in a big way. And so having seen television episodes that deal with that kind of brain surgery and stimulation, going back, this actually feels like a pretty plausible situation. And I think maybe at the time it seemed so outlandish that it was unfairly maligned. Because I think science hadn't caught up enough or wasn't advanced enough for this science fiction to really feel like, oh, okay, this could happen. This really could honestly happen. And there could be a highly advanced society that decided it's better to have, segregation of the sexes controlled by one, all-knowing brain, a controller, to propagate and facilitate the species and keep them separate except as needed, and have a matriarchal-esque society, I guess, because of, their ability to sort of move around and be accepted by most societies because, there's a soft spot for women. I don't know, however you want to view it. I actually thought it was a pretty good premise. I enjoyed it. It's always nice to see the hyper powerful aliens that have some kind of technology well beyond Starfleet. It's a great trope. And it is a trope, but it's always entertaining. We see this with the Borg. We see this with a lot of different episodes in Next Gen and Voyager and Deep Space Nine, where your sort of standard era humans have to find a way to deal with these extremely powerful, capable aliens and or sometimes godlike beings. And we've seen it on TOS before. Except this time it's not Kirk that overcomes them by, giving them riddles and talking them through it. This actually feels a little more like realistic and effective. The one thing I thought was a little goofy is that Spock is essentially literally brainless, yet his body is able to be manually stimulated and moving around, and his respiration is still there, all that stuff. Like, if he'd have been left a vegetable in a bed and they beam him down to do the surgery kind of thing, probably would have been a little more realistic, maybe would have gone over better. And then Kirk probably would have had to have been the vehicle to overcome the controller and the thing, and okay, it's not perfect, but I gotta say, I don't understand the hate. I really don't. Even if I look at this through the context of if this was a super far-fetched episode, it's Star Trek. It's supposed to be fantasy, science fiction, and seem unreal. Like Frankenstein, putting a brain into essentially a dead body made of spare parts. It should be very much just fiction. I mean, in the strangest ways, that's what fiction's all about. So I actually appreciated the episode. I thought it was a good opener for a new season, particularly one on such a stringent budget. Really, like you said, I think we've seen worse, for sure.
Well, to steal a line from UrzaMaster, I actually liked this episode. So, I did. I want to reflect a little bit on your comment about the tech, right? At least for that time. That's a beautiful thing about Star Trek, is that all these ideas, we've seen them come to life in our lifetime, right? Flip phones, like the flip communicator, the pad that they're writing on, and we see that Next Gen. We're going to see that, using tapping a pad in a sense to fly the ship, or just for any type of documentation purposes. We see that now. So I think that's one of the great things is those writers taking risks, in a sense, taking a risk and trying to make that believable, and now it's actually doable in our society today. Even the idea of a warp bubble is something that scientists have tried to, put into effect to possibly maneuver our ships in the future. So even that is something that has been pulled forward. So I think and again, it's all relative too, right? Looking back on it, we can see the value or those ideas kind of come forward. So we probably have an appreciation for that. But this episode even kind of reminded me a little bit of the movie Idiocracy, where it's, they're kind of relying on one uber smart person in a sense to keep everything going, which is kind of what Idiocracy was in a sense, I guess. I liked DeForest Kelly's acting at the end, where he was totally freaking out about, he put the helmet on and then it kind of gave him the knowledge, but almost scrambled his brain a little bit at a point, and then he was very, very frustrated towards the end of the episode before he was going to do the surgery. And I think, again, it's a testament to his acting chops. I also feel like this season, at least at the very beginning, and even the next episode, I think all of them are comfortable with who they are as their characters. Maybe Nimoy was struggling a little bit with the idea of, I might be Spock forever, but I feel like they were comfortable in their Star Trek skin of who their characters were. I think that came across. We even have, Shatner now doing a lot of his overacting, like he's really feeling his Kirk chops now. And we see that too. What was the other thing that I had? Embracing the character. Oh, I think nowadays the whole Nimoy thing is interesting, right? Because those people didn't want to be typecast. And I feel like it's the opposite now. I feel like people nowadays really embrace a character that they're known for, but I also think part of that could be due to them going out and doing the convention circuits, right? And kind of being known for that. Like Chris Evans is Captain America, right? Like that's what you think of. I know he was kind of walked away this year's, but he's talking about coming back. Robert Downey Jr. is talking about coming back. Kyle MacLachlan is perfectly happy kind of being known as Dale Cooper. So I think, because that's all he is to me and that's all he'll ever be, is Dale Cooper. That's it. So, even when I see him in TV shows, I'm like, that's Dale Cooper. So, it's not Kyle MacLachlan, it's Dale Cooper. But, so I think it's nice to kind of see that switch up in terms of people embracing their characters instead of trying to walk away from it. I really truly think it benefits the lower tier actors, because when they're able to go out on these convention circuits, that probably keeps them in, it probably keeps an income flow for them when they're not doing any acting. It keeps money in their pockets. Look at former sports players. They do it. I mean, they're still making money by going out and signing their autographs. Let me give you just a quick example, because I like talking. Speaking of Jerry Ryan, which we will have her on this podcast at some point. I'm telling you that right now. There's a convention that's going to be in Chicago, and you can sign up to get her autograph and or get a picture with her. Just to get her autograph, it's $80. To get a picture with her, it's another $120. Now, think about if just 100 people signed up for that, which it's going to be more. That's a good day. One, right? And the convention's 3 days. So these people are making that extra dough by doing those conventions as well and embracing those characters. So I think that's something else that we're going to kind of see here. Go ahead, Fert. You're just foaming at the mouth to say something, Fert. Go ahead.
Just imagine how much this Warp Core crew could make at conventions then. I mean, based on those prices, I mean...
Oh, we'll be there.
The sky's the limit, gentlemen.
Yeah. Hey, $50. $50 to have a picture taken with me. That's all I'm going to charge.
Right, and $150 if you want the whole pack, the whole sandwich. You have to get, I like it. So,
I will say that it's an interesting point about being pigeonholed and how actors used to worry about that, you know. And it's so weird to see that shift now where like people are truly happy like being known as Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, and those characters
Axel
change
Foley.
lives. Axel Foley. But what I find very interesting is the actors who don't have that, but are still like leading roles, they sort of seem to almost be bit players, in my opinion. Like you get the leading ladies of today's romance movies, you know, the dramas or the romantic comedies, who really aren't known as anything else. They're just, oh yeah, you star in, you know, Romancing the Drywall with such and such a dude, and your name's such and such a gal. Huge, highly paid, you know, maybe even a brilliant performance from this actor, and she's just, I couldn't tell you what movie she's in. She's been in a bunch of them. They're all basically the same. It's like Hallmark movies. But Scarlett Johansson steps into Black Widow, and she's forever Black Widow. Not to say she wasn't brilliant in a bunch of other movies, because she absolutely was. But why wouldn't you want to be recognized as, oh, you're this person in this movie that made $1 billion? Like, yeah, I want to be known by that. Like, that sign me up. If somebody said, oh, you're UrzaMaster from the Warp Core podcast, you're like, yeah, sure enough, you got me. You got me. I'm not Mike Judge, but I try. You know, it's just, it's odd to think that there was a time where it was like, no, I want to be known for my range. But ranges are very easy to forget. Who here can name one picture that Laurence Olivier was in? He was in a bunch of them, a bunch of stage work. But is there one performance, like, do you think of him as Hamlet? I guess, maybe?
Clash of the Titans.
Yeah, I guess Clash of the Titans. But what was his name in Clash of the Titans? I don't remember. I know I saw it.
Zeus.
Mike? Zeus. Okay. Sure. That could be wrong, and I really wouldn't know. You know, but he's obviously legendary, fantastic, and I'm not knocking anybody like that from that era, but can you imagine if Olivier was known as
Magneto.
Big Brother? Or Magneto, or you know, one of these giant characters of huge gravitas that changed a generation, like these Star Trek actors. So when I think of Spock's brain and how maligned, I think erroneously it was, and how the conflict of being Spock weighed on Leonard Nimoy, I mean, I could see why they took his brain. Like, bro, you can't think about that. It's a blessing as much as it is a curse, and I think in time you'll find it's much more a blessing than a curse.
Well, I think Will Wheaton's an excellent example of that. He was did not want to be known as Wesley Crusher, and guess what? He's Wesley Crusher. I mean, that's what he's known for, but he's embraced it, right? Like using with his podcast and going on the convention circuit. And the guy who played Captain Liam Shaw, he even tweeted out like, at one point, I am Captain Shaw, and I will be at all the Star Trek conventions. Like, he's doing the whole tour. He's kind of grabbed onto or maybe, you know, moved towards this whole Star Trek group and wants to be a part of it. Now, whether it's because he sees the financial gain or he feels it's a little bit being part of that Star Trek family, he's still embracing that role. And he knows that people loved him enough in that role that we want him back. We've even said it. Like, I would love to see something going backwards with him as a captain, just the way, because he played a captain the way we really haven't seen that. Yeah. Right? We haven't seen that type of captain.
He had the most character development on Star Trek Picard.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And honestly, of any Star Trek character, I think he had the most character development, except maybe Q. It was incredible. That performance was incredible. And this is the thing, is like, you got to remember the guy's on like, what, 6 episodes of Star Trek? And we're talking about him like he's, you know, Hollywood Walk of Fame, like, you know, one of the most influential actors of all time. But it's just like, this is what a character like that, what writing like that can do for an actor, and I can't imagine not wanting that. I can't imagine being like, I don't really want to be known for this thing I did for like 6 weeks of my life. There are other. I'm sure he wants to do other things, which is totally fine. But embracing the love, that's like the smartest thing you could do. Because when you run away from it, you become, I don't know, sort of forgotten in a way. Leonard Nimoy in the ensuing years after Star Trek until the motion picture, like other than what the Ballad of Bilbo Baggins, what did he do? He wrote "I am not Spock, I am Spock." Like,
Well, even Bill Shatner, right? We've read the stories
lived in
about
his
him,
van.
yeah, living in a van down by the river. Like it was that bad for Bill Shatner, and luckily, Star
T.J.
Trek was
Hooker.
able to make that comeback, which I still
And TJ
believe
Hooker.
had something to do with Star Wars coming out and making sci-fi popular and doing it correctly, gave life to a lot of that sci-fi. That's another reason why we owe something to Star Wars.
But our historical perspectives aside, as we kick off season 3, as we are oft wont to do on the Warp Core podcast, let us bestow upon it the Warp Core ratings we feel appropriate for this venture into the last season of the original series. Fert Derby, where do you find Spock's Brain?
This one's an easy 4.5. Like I said, far from the worst. It probably needed another rewrite or two, and some spit and polish to really start to raise it into that upper pantheon of truly transcendent Trek. But I see what they were doing. I had fun with it. There's no reason to chase it with pitchforks and torches. It's solid, middle of the road Trek, in my opinion. And why else are we watching this show? If you don't like it, turn on Marcus Welby. I mean, this is what we want to see every Friday night at 10 p.m. apparently, according to NBC executives.
I'll go next. Too bad. Look, this is going to sound a weird way to describe it. This could have been much worse, this episode. I really think they did the most with it that they could, which is why I will also give it 4.5 warp cores. It could have easily been a 1 or a 1.5, but somehow it got carried through. And I think part of it had to do with the ending with DeForest Kelley's acting, and that's been one of the great things about Star Trek in general. These actors have really had a chance to show their acting chops in a sense throughout the series. So yeah, I'll go 4.5. What say you, Urza?
I'm going to round us out with 4.5. Total agreement. I've never gone into an episode on such a razor's edge, like this could be really good, this could be really bad, and I ended up feeling mostly pleasantly surprised. It was a little goofy at times, but that's okay. And yeah, I think the acting, especially on DeForest Kelley's part, carried us through. I also feel like having the bulk of the cast in the episode really helped this one out. That was nice to see. So I look forward to the rest of season 3. I think 4.5 is a decent start. That's a teaser, really, for what may come. So until next time, don't let Spock's brain fool you. Let it control you. And live long and prosper.